is a pretty famous landmark that many Indians know about. And that landmark is a mountain called Mount Kailash, which is really close to where Eastern Tibet is. Or, sorry, I should say Kham is. So Chogyam Trungpa was a particularly advanced meditation master, and he had these Kagyu teachings. And what had happened for him is he actually met with a Nyingma teacher. It's a different lineage in Tibetan Buddhism, by the name of Khenpo Gangshar. And that teacher, Khenpo Gangshar, proceeded to give him some very advanced teachings in a very short amount of time. Now remember that Chogyam Trungpa, at this point, was only 16 years of age, and had spent his whole life up until that point meditating and actually getting teachings from his teachers. Now along comes this teacher named Khenpo Gangshar, and Khenpo Gangshar gave him a further elaboration of crazy wisdom teachings, and gave it to him in such a short period of time, with the actual understanding that he told Chogyam Trungpa that at some point very soon, you'll have to leave Tibet. He had a vision that a red army is coming. Later this actually was a premonition of the Red Chinese army that actually came into Tibet to liberate Tibet. And so there was a sense of urgency. So he gave them these teachings, and they kind of were bonded together. And in 1959, sure enough, the Dalai Lama, a few other Tibetan teachers left. Chogyam Trungpa was one of them. He basically packed everything up, packed up his whole life, and he, along with about 500 people, left on foot from Eastern Tibet to make this arduous journey to India. And along the way, they were shot at, they were hunted by the Chinese Liberation Army, and it was about a 6-month trek on foot. And he was carrying all of the precious teachings, if you can just imagine, that he had learned himself, and of the previous incarnations of the Trungpa lineage. And by the time they actually crossed, I think there was maybe just over a dozen people that survived out of 500 in India. And then that was it. There was no more Tibet. There was no more Tibet for the Dalai Lama, for Chogyam Trungpa, for Tibetans that actually made this trek into India. So they had to start life completely over. And it is here where he first started to kind of, at the Young Lama's Institute of Daoist, they organized, and Chogyam Trungpa was actually made a meditation instructor for all the people in India by the Dalai Lama. And it's actually the Dalai Lama that organized Chogyam Trungpa's scholarship to Oxford, England, into which Chogyam Trungpa went to England, studied English, and had to carry this, we can say, the weight of an entire lineage with him to somehow plant it into the West. And at a time where all of these precious teachings, these precious Tibetan and Indian teachings, were now in the hands of a few very obviously skillful masters. And so Chogyam Trungpa really did that. He took that kind of on himself, and he first, with another teacher by the name of Akon Rinpoche, created the first Tibetan Buddhist kind of monastery, you could say. It was more of a kind of foundation called Same Ling in Scotland. So that was in 1967. But then shortly after that, he came to the West. And when Trungpa Rinpoche came to the West, he had to meet the American people, the North Americans and the Canadians. And he didn't know what to do, because he had grown up If you can imagine, you've grown up in a different culture altogether. And coming into the West in the 1970s is the first people that came to listen to Chogyam Trungpa talk were mostly hippies. They were mostly people that are from the Woodstock era, the 1960s. You didn't have a lot of the intellectuals. And so he decided to meet the actual student, as they say, with their mind. So he became very controversial. He was the first Tibetan Lama to ditch his robes, his traditional robes, and he started giving talks in suits. He dressed up like the Westerners, in ties and suits, because he felt that presentation and how these teachings were actually first heard was everything. And he was very successful. And so as the story goes, in 17 years, the 17 years that he lived in North America, he established over, I think it was like 25, 30 centers across the country, founded a university called Naropa University, which is the first university of Buddhist psychology. And that particular university was founded by some pretty important people in the United States who actually came to hear Chogyam Trungpa teach and then became his students. And some of those people were William S. Burroughs, who's a great author, and Allen Ginsberg. Maybe some of you may know who Allen Ginsberg is. So he, and a number of other people as well. And when Naropa University first came into being, the people that were teaching were some of the most amazing teachers that were actually in America at the time. So people like Ram Dass were actually part of the curriculum. Chogyam Trungpa was part of the curriculum. There were a number of amazing intellectual, academic, actual teachers, as well as spiritual teachers that helped to grow Naropa University. So again, this Tibetan teacher came into this environment and actually helped to plant the seeds of this precious teachings of Tibetan Buddhism. The other thing that I think is actually worth noting is he also brought the teachings of these advanced Vajrayana teachings, which up until this point in the East, in Tibet and in India, you had to be a monk in order to receive those teachings. Chogyam Trungpa opened those teachings to the layperson. That means that if you were a practitioner, there were some actual requirements you had to follow, but you could actually go to a Tibetan Vajrayana seminary for 3 months and get these advanced teachings. And he had so much trust in the West and his Western students that he started to kind of teach in this way. It's pretty remarkable, actually, if you think about it, because that's exactly how Tibetan Buddhism, as we know it today, that's one element is how far it's propagated, because he touched so many people and so many students who have now become teachers, famous ones, in fact. So when we talk about people like Reginald Ray and Robert Thurman and a lot of these other kind of like academic scholars that are in America, a lot of them actually are influenced by Chogyam Trungpa. So the teachings that he brought into the West, and these Vajrayana teachings, were very, very unique. And I want to read to you an excerpt from this book to give you just an idea, a taste of kind of not only Chogyam Trungpa's kind of vision, but how serious he was about propagating the Dharma, as we can say. Just read this for you. This is one of the first books that he wrote. Just read this little excerpt. A tantric revolution took place in India many centuries ago. The wisdom of that tradition has been handed down orally from generation to generation by the great Mahasiddhas or Tantric masters. Therefore, Tantra is known as the ear-whispered or secret lineage. However, the notion of secrecy does not imply that Tantra is like a foreign language. It is not as though our parents speak two languages, but they only teach us English so that they can use Chinese or Yiddish when they want to keep a secret from us. Rather, Tantra introduces us to the actuality of the phenomenal world. It is one of the most advanced, sharp, and extraordinary perceptions that has ever developed. It is unusual and eccentric. It is powerful, magical, and outrageous, but it is also extremely simple. I think this is an important context because a lot of times we kind of tend to talk about Tibetan Buddhism and how different it is from, say, India. But really, Chogyam Trungpa had such reverence for both Tibetan culture, Indian culture, and cultures of the East that he actually, when he taught, he kept the preservation of the Indian root of the Sanskrit teachings and these basic precious teachings. So you can kind of see a little bit here how he really was forward-thinking in kind of his thought about how important these teachings are and keeping them. The other aspect of what Trungpa Rinpoche did was when he came to the West and he started teaching in the 70s, he is actually known as what's called a Turtan, which basically just means he had the ability to actually receive certain teachings. Some of them were secret teachings. And when we say secret teachings in this context, we talk about the secret teachings of the mind. Some of them were actually physical Tantra teachings that he had to go to places. Like one such Dharma was actually in Nepal, where he had to actually go there. Other ones were actually he discovered in his mind. And to kind of reconnect back, in the late 70s, early 80s, as he was teaching the Buddha Dharma to Westerners, to Americans, to Canadians, to Europeans, they started becoming really good practitioners. And then in the late 70s, early 80s, he received one such teaching, mystical teaching, about Shambhala vision again. So here we are coming back to Shambhala. And he realized that these were the teachings that are actually needed. And in fact, you can actually see this online, where he talks about, back in the late 70s, that the world is actually dipping further into chaos and into darkness. And so this vision of Shambhala vision came to him. And so he started teaching about Shambhala. Again, just like Suchandra had heard from Shakyamuni Buddha and the Enlightened Society, he started teaching about Enlightened Society and how we as human beings have basic goodness. And that is that basic goodness that doesn't require us to do anything, but just to touch into our own goodness that will actually save humanity in the future, especially as things become more dark. As the dark age continues to manifest and actually starts to get seemingly worse, it is actually humanity's goodness that'll actually save itself. So these are the basic teachings of the Shambhala lineage. So, in recap a little bit, we've gone from Shakyamuni Buddha to Padmasambhava, crazy wisdom teachings, and Chogyam Trungpa. And his eldest son, Sakyam Mipa Rinpoche, you can see on the table, became the head of the Shambhala lineage in 1995. Chogyam Trungpa died in 1987. And there was a gap of almost 10 years where there wasn't a spiritual head of Shambhala. And this is a kind of a interesting time because the community was kind of, we can say, on shaky ground. And the Shambhala and the Sakyam hadn't quite taken his seat, as we say, as the lineage holder. But then he did. And when he did, what he has done in the last 20 years is he's expanded the Shambhala vision and expanded more about householder practice and brought a lot of these teachings out into the world. And it is actually under the Sakyong where we've seen Shambhala grow from, say, 20 or maybe 40 or 50 centers to now over 250 centers across the world. So Shambhala as an actual practice and as an actual lineage is very strong and alive. And he, along with other teachers, are really starting to talk about kind of good human society and basic goodness, and really starting to fortify this idea of the Shambhala vision. And the Sakyong has really taken his father's teachings that were just started in the late 70s and 80s, and now expanding them to be very, very accessible